Today's webinar will look at data literature mirroring and how that is a back and forward juggling. The webinar will be fourfold. We will start providing a general overview about mirroring. Then we will go into the details on how data and literature review can be mirrored out through the research. We will then look into prerequisites that are necessary for mirroring to work out. And in the fourth part and final part of the webinar, we will look on how mirroring can work within the different sections of our thesis. Okay, so the purpose of this webinar is for you to understand how the data and literature parts relate to each other, how mirroring can be used as a technique to develop the structure of your thesis, and how it can be used as an analytical tool to critically assess the relevant fields and how they are covered. Now, in a nutshell, mirroring is providing three fundamental things to you. On the one hand, it is a useful tool to map out how the research belongs to each other. So you can clearly understand where you are in the research process and how the different things relate to each other. It provides you with a mean to look holistically at your thesis as done in this image. So you clearly understand what you're talking about. In this case, we used music as an example. So if the data tells us there is a guitar, then the literature review perhaps also will need to cover guitars, and in the analytics and the conclusion, we also should mention guitars. So if this is not the case, then certainly anything would not be as expected. Now, in this case here, you clearly can see that the literature is not covering a trumpet. So it is on you to decide whether the trumpet is not important, because if it's part of the findings and analysis, then perhaps you would expect it to be part of the literature review, unless it is an unexpected finding, which is rather the outcome of your research, but not the starting point, and therefore you took an informed decision to not cover the trumpet within the literature review. So it is also a mean to provide you with boundaries, or to establish the boundaries, so to clearly see and understand, okay, this is a part that should be covered still in the literature, or this is a part that you might not want to cover. Does that make sense thus far? Okay, so mirroring is what, very well. Mirroring is also a gradual process. It's nothing that happens from one day to another. It's something that gradually will build up as you go along. So as you make sense out of your research, you slowly will start to establish key terms, like in the earlier slide seen. Key terms here would be, for example, music, drums, trumpets, guitar. So those are keywords that are not clear from day one of the research, but only as you go along and as you start with mapping out the problem, they will become available. And usually the mapping out of the problem is a good start into the research. For example, if you have here something where you look at perception issues, guiding policy, contract management. So those are keywords that become clear over time, and that then help you to look more focused into the literature review, and also afterwards to go more focused into the data collection, to know exactly what are you asking and talking about in the different literature, in the different stakeholder interactions, and what you pick up from the literature and take into the stakeholder interactions, and how to frame and ask questions. So it's a very structured way. It's providing you with a very structured way into your research. Now, and it's a front and back forward. So for example, if the first stakeholder interactions shows that you're talking about perception issues, about something with a community-based situation, and that it's leading to resistance, then those are the keywords that slowly will make it into your mapping, and thereby you can gradually build up your overview on how the research belongs to each other. Is that making sense up to now here, to that point? Are there any questions?
That makes sense, sir. Thank you.
It makes sense. Thank you.
All right. And now it also allows you to go back into the methodology chapter and to bring the knowledge, to leverage it from the literature into the methods that you apply. For example, if you look into studies that are carried out in the same condition as you carry out your research, then you can take that as related literature. So you bring it into your methods section, and you can say and justify why you used methods or why you used some questions, because you draw on it. So it helps you to make sense and provides a logic for your thesis. And afterwards, you can take it further from the methodology again into the stakeholder engagements. So it becomes part and supports you on how you collect the data, thereby again providing justification and guidance. So this is, as said, a gradual process, nothing that happens from one day to another. And at one point, you will be enabled to talk about your research in a more holistic way. So it will provide you with a mean of explaining clearly to others how your work has been processing and how the different parts connect to each other. Now, for example, this schematic representation of the research design is part of the introduction chapter. So one would assume it was part of the beginning of the research. However, you only would manage to be that precise very likely at the very end of your research, because only at that point in time you will have built up all of your key terms and will have settled on how things belong to each other. So likewise, this is a table which was part of the introduction chapter of the thesis, which is showing how the research is belonging to each other. You can see the different colorings add very well up. In this case, for example, as the chapter 1 introduction and the chapter 2, 3, and 4 literature match exactly with the empirical work of the thesis. So you can see if 1.1 is talking about energy use and sustainability, then the literature equally is covering energy use and sustainability. And likewise, the empirical work will talk about it. For example, if you look at the research question, you will see characteristics of energy use, determinants of energy use, or understanding of energy. So it all adds up. We can see how key terms are used consistently through the work, and therefore it allows you to have a very clear understanding about your thesis and to articulate exactly how the different parts of the work belong to each other and where the data is coming from and where it is flowing to. So again, this is something that only over time will become clear. Now, in the next part, we will look a bit more closely on how the data and literature review belong to each other. But up to this point, are there any general questions with regard on how mirroring is working out in general? Is there anyone wanting to raise a question? Okay, so then let's look at this from a slightly different angle by seeing how data and literature relate to each other. Now, I think what is important here is if we talk about literature, it's not a one point in time situation that we are talking at, but there are different dimensions. Now, usually one would start initially by reading a bit in the literature, and this is a point where one can, on the one hand, get lost or stay forever, but at the other hand, it's also providing you with an initial understanding about the problem and how it is occurring. Now, at this point in time, the stakeholder engagement will impact how you further continue reading the literature, because as soon as you engage with the stakeholders, you will you will collect data, you will receive some feedback, and this is providing you with some initial key terms that allows you to go more focused back to the literature, and this then is helping you to shape and take the research further. So we talk about different times in the research process, and at those different times, the mirroring will kick in a different way. And this is now my son coming in. Hello, Moritz.
Wann du wirst du essen?
Papa is currently telephoning.
Nein, wenn du wirst du essen.
Später gleich. Aber Papa muss jetzt noch ein bisschen arbeiten. Sag Hallo zu allen. Da hören ganz viele Männer zu.
Hello.
Hello. Okay. So, and here we continue now again. Now I'm a bit lost, I have to say. I talked about how at different times in the process mirroring is working out differently. So at the initial point in time, it allows you to go in a structured way from the findings and stakeholder engagements. So to map out your thesis and the different parts that are covered in it. In this slide, for example, we see how the different elements are addressed or can be addressed from the data and findings. The data and findings that we collect can help us in the problem and issue statement framing, in the research questions, so to gradually map the different things out and how they belong to each other. Now, if you excuse me, I just quickly need to close the door again that my son just opened. All right, so, and now let's continue here. So as soon as we start collecting data, we will work gradually out the different problem domains that exist in our research. And this will then allow us to go very structured through our thesis and to start drafting it up. As said initially, mirroring is a tool to map out the research, but it is also a mean to provide a holistic view. And the holistic view comes best together if we work over the table of content, because there we clearly can see, do we use the same key terms consistently across the literature and the findings and the analysis, or do we call things differently, or do we look at different things? So initially, very likely a table of content won't be that harmonic like we see here in this example, but you will have a lot of colors in the literature review where you just were reading something that you consider to be of importance, but that might never will make it into your thesis. So you give all of those different fields, different domains that you have uncovered in the literature, a different coloring, and this different coloring afterwards can help you once the findings and data become available to see what do you need to take further or what you can let go about. Now, in case of our earlier example, by taking music, it provides you with a clear illustration and overview on how things might belong to each other or how they are covering. If we talk about energy here in this case, then you exactly can see in the blue one, we talk about in the literature about behaviors, motivations, and barriers. Now the counterpart to that would be factors that are influencing energy at home. And then you can see at 7.1 motivational variables and energy efficient behaviors. So this relates clearly to the literature part where you cover motivations and barriers in the literature review, and you have it also covered in the findings and analysis, whereby 7.1 would look at motivational variables and 7.2 would look at barriers. So if you look at motivations and barriers in your analysis, then you certainly will also need to cover it in the literature review if you have it at such a high level. If it would come down to the second or third level heating, then perhaps it's something that just was emerging as part of the findings. And therefore you could take a deliberate decision, like here in the case with the trumpet, that this should not be covered in the thesis. And ultimately, this holistic view will help you to understand the patterns and trends that you are dealing with, or that you have been uncovered at the work, or that the literature review is pointing to. So it allows you to have a very systemic view of your thesis, or to work towards such systemic view throughout your research. Now, before we come into the third part of the webinar, looking at prerequisites, are there any questions with regards on the data and literature review and how mirroring gradually can help you in matching and connecting the different parts of your research, thereby working out in a more structured way how things belong to each other, and using the table of content, for example, as a mean, as a high-level mean to keep track of what you're doing? Are there any questions to this point in view and time? All right. So then let's look into prerequisites for mirroring to work. And there are few, and they are actually quite simple. One of the things, and I think this is generally what research is about, it needs preciseness, and words do matter. Now, this is a bit tricky because at the beginning of the research, one is a bit overwhelmed with the literature, and things that are called by one name or by one author are called very differently by other authors. As two examples, once I started my research, it was a time where e-learning was quite hype and fashion. Now, after e-learning came e-teaching. After e-teaching came open educational resources. Once people started talking about open educational resources, they talked about very much open education because that was more easy to sell to funding organizations. Then it became open educational practices. Now, within the time frame of like 10, 15 years, it was called, the same was called by so many names. While in practice, we looked about technology-enhanced learning, which is just another word that it could be called by. Now, understanding this at the beginning of your research journey is a very hard and challenging thing. So it's not to be expected that this preciseness is there from day one, but it's something as gradually as the mirroring process is that you should be aiming for. Now, another example on confusion is, let's look at open source software, which also comes by the name free and open source software, because there is a difference to some person. And they want to make sure that there is a difference in between, that difference in between free, as in free beer, is understood. Now, however, if you talk about free as in free beer, there's also another meaning of freedom that is not expressed if you use the English word free. Thereby, some of my fellow colleagues started calling it free, libre, open source software, because the libre word covered that dimension. Now we talk here about the same piece of software called by three very different terms, all producing papers and tons of research going into very different directions. Now, again, once you start with your research, it's not to be expected that you can be aware of that, and it's something that only gradually will be built up. So preciseness does matter, and so do words. As much as a purpose, like why am I doing this? I think this is a sensible question that one should ask oneself from time to time. And often the answer is, I really don't know why I am doing this, but I have I have an idea, or I have an assumption. So all of those things, again, preciseness matters, should be very well spelled out and kept track about, because keeping track and keeping this level of preciseness helps us to gradually write up our thesis. Because all of the things that we are doing at the beginning, we still might use at the end towards the thesis, just for a different purpose, or just perhaps as setting the narrative and providing us with a storyline for our thesis. So if we keep track, if we work very carefully, if we understand the purpose, then we can see how we advance, and we should keep all of the drafts in a very organized way so that they can help us and provide us with the guidance throughout the thesis. Talking about keeping track, so this is allowing us exactly to see how the thesis would be changing over time. If we do know, okay, those are our keywords that we settled on currently, then we will clearly understand once those keywords might change. So it's simple things to be looked out, but that will help us to not lose developments, but to leverage them across the thesis. Now, if the problem domains, for example, do change, and they likely will change over time because our understanding is advancing of the problem, so does then the literature review, the introduction, the research questions, all of that will be impacted by that. So it's a mutual impacting, and mirroring can help you to make sense of that in a very structured way. Now, we come into the fourth part, looking how mirroring works out within the sections. Are there any questions with regards to the prerequisites? Okay. Now, this table, again, is the result of the very end of the research process, where we can see how empirical study findings relate to the literature and what are the observations that can be made out of that. And if you see the research question column in the middle, it also shows how those findings and the literature address the research questions. Now, this table provides you in itself with a clear narrative that you can take further into the sections. You can see the keywords that are used in the different sections of the thesis. And then once you dive into those sections, you can make use of this table and make clear, okay, if I'm talking about the heating, about motivational variables and efficient behaviors, then the narrative also should focus on motivations and behaviors. If I'm not using those words consistently, then very likely something is not adding up. Either within the sections, I am not talking about what I'm saying I'm talking about, or the heating is not correct. So this is something that can be clearly seen from this table, which is a summary of one of the data findings and analysis chapters. So it can support you in the writing of your thesis, but it also is a very good mean for the reader of your thesis to clearly understand how the thesis is belonging together and what to find where. So it once again provides you with a mean to have a holistic view very quickly of the thesis. So if someone sees a table of content and then knows, okay, the summary is also talking about that, and the research question 2A is talking about that in section 7.1. So it's very clear to the reader how the thesis is adding up. And it provides you as the author of your thesis with a very good mean on having a guidance to write up your thesis. This is a simple, by the end, tool, but it's very effective once you work through your thesis, because you always can clearly see and make sense out of the sections and can clearly see if what you're talking about intersections is really also how you call things. So again, it's a useful tool and guide to write up the thesis. And with this, I'm coming into the last slide. So we are stopping the recording of the webinar right here.